is cosmos, cosmos found within chaos. This quotation from Madeleine L'Engle's Walking on Water has become a little bit more relevant, I think, to all of us in the past few weeks as the world around us, the world we thought we knew, has been turned upside down in many ways. And this quote was also one, when I was preparing this presentation and kind of going back through some of my old journals, it jumped out at me. I had written it in my journal during a season of adjusting to life as a new mom. So it felt particularly relevant for this presentation. So first of all, if you are experiencing some kind of chaos in your life at the moment, and I imagine most of us are, you are in the right place. So welcome, and my heartfelt thanks to the Anselm Society for inviting me to participate in this wonderful online event with such an incredible lineup of speakers. I'm truly humbled and honored to be joining them. My name is Ashlee Cowles, and this is a presentation on creating cosmos in the chaos of family life. Now, I'm sure there's probably some more visual learners with us today, so the high school teacher in me wants to honor that, so I'm just going to start by sharing my screen with a few visuals. So if this was a live session, this would be the part where I ask you, does anyone know the meaning of the word cosmos? So here's what I found when consulting a few dictionaries. It can mean the universe as a whole, as seen as a well-ordered whole. It can simply mean world or order. And the Greek cosmos appears about 188 times in the New Testament, and it's always in reference to some kind of ordering that is the result of God's activity in the world. So really, anytime we are participating in the activity of arranging or ordering or creating harmony, we are participating in making a kind of cosmos. And that, according to Madeleine L'Engle, is really what all art comes down to. And it's also what Heidi White referred to in her wonderful talk on participating in the great story. We can't create our own cosmos, only God has that power, but as co-creators made in his image, we are invited to participate in forming meaning out of chaos. And this is really crucial. It's even a radical idea, I think, and a reminder in an age when art has often been used to deconstruct rather than to cultivate order and harmony within, whatever unique situations of chaos we happen to find ourselves. So since we are all really in a situation that probably feels chaotic on multiple levels, I have two questions for you to keep in mind throughout this talk. First, what is the source of chaos in your life right now? And maybe try to be real specific about that. And second, how might God be asking you to help him create a cosmos in this particular place? Because we're hearing all these messages about what a strange, unprecedented time we are living in. And while we're certainly dealing with some challenges that we really haven't dealt with as a society in several generations, chaos is nothing new in this fallen world. In fact, it's the norm. If you look back, at many of the brilliant works of art by the Italian Renaissance masters we all love and admire now, they were often interrupted by bouts of plague and had to, take a break from their work because of the sickness spreading through society. And that was in the age that gave us the Renaissance. So my hope is that by looking at the lives of, different writers and artists that I'm going to talk about today, we'll be reminded that chaos, even kind of the more small scale chaos we all experience, just in our ordinary lives as creative people who, may also be husbands and wives or parents or people with other demanding vocations, those just kind of ordinary ways that our life, we can feel pulled in a bunch of different directions and feel like our lives are kind of descending into chaos. I hope this is a reminder that these places of chaos can actually be the fertile soil of meaning, of beauty, and ultimately of cosmos. I also just want to take a quick moment to clarify who this talk is for, because even though I'm going to be focusing on family life quite a bit, and we'll use a lot of examples related to parenting in particular, since I think that's a particularly all-consuming season of life for anyone, but maybe for artists and writers in particular. This message is still, for any Christian, because we're all made in the image of God. We all have creative capacity. So whether or not you label yourself, officially as an artist or as a writer, or even if you're not necessarily in a season of caretaking at the moment, we are all creatures with creative capacity who exist in a web of complex relationships and demands, and it tends to be messy and often feel chaotic. So, working towards health and wholeness in those places is always going to be a creative act of cosmos. And that really just means that the vocation of an artist and our relational vocations as Christians who are meant to be in community with both God and with others, they really involve a very similar posture and response to the call that we all be life givers and co-creators with God. Okay, so just a little bit about me. Who am I and why am I sharing about this particular topic? I'll start with just a personal story to clarify that. My journey as a fiction author has been interesting in that I've tended to birth books and babies at about the same time, and definitely didn't plan it that way. It's just how things have turned out. I'm actually 7 months pregnant right now, and my second traditionally published novel will come out just a few months after the birth of my son. And my first published novel, Beneath Wandering Stars, came out just a few months before the birth of my daughter, who's pictured here and is now almost 3. So it's been really interesting to, walk through these two different kinds of births at about the same time. And, I'll be the first to admit that I definitely had quite a bit of fear around how compatible parenthood, motherhood would be with a creative vocation. And there's one moment in particular that really kind of captures this and stands out in my memory. So my debut novel received an award when I was about a week away from giving birth, which meant that when I went to the award ceremony and had to go up to the stage to accept the award, I was very, very pregnant. And, by the time, it took me a while to kind of waddle up there to the stage. But when I finally made it, I remember having kind of a strange thought, which was that this could either be the beginning of my writing career, or it could be the high point of it, or maybe even the end of it, because I just really didn't know, what it was going to look like to be a writer and also be a new mom. But notice, kind of the either or statement mindset of even just that phrase. It's either the beginning of things or it's the end of it. But I think this story really gets at how the creative life is often presented in our culture when it comes to relationships and other real life obligations. It's kind of it can be seen as this dichotomy. So I had worked, for about 8 years to this moment of publication, and had gone through all those major milestones that writers will talk about, such as writing multiple manuscripts before I actually had a finished work that was publishable, finding an agent. Actually, it took about 3 agents before I had a publishing deal, and then of course getting lots and lots of rejection letters all along the way. So, here I was, had a published novel finally, and kind of feeling like, oh, I have some momentum now. Things are starting to happen. And I was about to have a baby. So talk about, chaos in the midst of all of that. And it turned out that in a lot of ways, my concerns were valid. Having a newborn did completely turn my plans, my schedule, my creative routine upside down. And it did feel like being plunged into chaos as far as, my identity goes in a lot of ways, because something that had been the focus for such a long time that I had been working towards now had to be set aside a little bit. And right about the time when others kind of looking in from the outside might say like, oh, look, you finally made it. You finally, reached this goal you had been working toward. So that's why I'm immensely grateful that I was, and I don't think it's a coincidence, that I was part of the Anselm Society's Artists Guild at that time. That was definitely a very grounding place to be, during this season of adjustment. And it also led me to another creative soul and mentor some of you probably know, Lancia Smith. And if you don't know her, definitely check out her talk for this presentation. You just trust me, you won't want to miss it. But I was talking on the phone to Lancia one day, probably, sharing about some of the struggles of trying to balance, caring for a baby in her first year of life while trying to write a sequel while having a day job as well. And she said something to me that I'll never forget and that I'm immensely grateful for. She said, Ashlee, raising a child between birth and the age of 5 is the most creative thing you'll ever do. And that resulted in many things, a major mindset shift for one. It also resulted in the birth of a website called The Most Creative Thing, which I run, and it's a place to interview different writers and artists who are, trying to deepen their artistic vocation in the midst of motherhood. But the mindset shift, I think, was the most important thing. And it's where I started to view motherhood and a creative vocation, like writing, not as contradictory forces in conflict. And I think that's how it felt the first couple of months. Like, these are two things that are always going to feel like, if I'm pursuing one, I'm sacrificing the other. And it's always going to be this source of tension and conflict. But I really started to try to change how I was seeing things and view creativity and motherhood as two different types of creativity, really, that could actually feed and benefit one another. And that's really what I want to get into now for the rest of this talk. So my hope here is that by sharing a little bit of my own personal journey of vocation, we can also answer a larger question, which is, how did we as a culture, as a society get here? How do we get to this place of feeling like our creative gifts and drives are, inherently in conflict with so-called real life? So I just want to start with a little bit of history. We'll look at the ideal of the eccentric genius, or kind of the romantic notion of the artist as this kind of solitary exception who doesn't have to play by the rules and the demands of life that, ordinary people have to deal with. And this is a topic that the Anselm Society has been covering quite a bit leading up to this event. And it's been really great. So definitely check out some of the recent podcasts and blog posts on this topic of, the eccentric genius versus the centric artist. But I'll just give you a quick summary in case you didn't see that material. So this idea of the eccentric genius basically refers to, it's something that kind of arose in the late 18th century, early 19th century with the Romantic movement in art and literature. And it's almost become kind of a caricature of artists as the outsider who doesn't really fit into society, who abandons a lot of social norms, you know, for the sake of art. And they could even be justified in doing so, or viewed as being justified in doing so, because that's how you cultivate genius. Again, it's become kind of such a stereotype that maybe we just kind of accept that that's how artists have always been, kind of on the fringe of society. But you know, it hasn't been the norm for most of Western history. If we look back at some of the artists and writers in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, for example, they couldn't just, you know, kind of live on the fringe and do whatever they wanted. They had other people they had to answer to, including the patrons who funded their art, including the church itself, and usually a long tradition of other artists in their discipline that they knew and that they were in a constant dialogue with. So for example, a Renaissance writer like William Shakespeare, he's great not only because of his own imagination, his own unique ability with words, but because he's picking up on a conversation that started long before him, you know, with Homer and the ancient Greeks, with Virgil and with Dante, and a dozen other masters in between. So he's in conversation with those other writers in his plays. So in other words, you know, creativity it existed within certain constraints, and those constraints weren't really understood as limits on creativity, but as a way to express truth, beauty, and goodness in a deeper and more meaningful way, because it went far beyond just the individual artists and their self-expression. Now, you know, the constraints in our day may look a bit different, but I think they're still there. There's lots of things that put a constraint on our creativity. For many writers and artists, this may mean acknowledging that we're usually not funded by patrons or by the church, and so we're probably going to have some other kind of day job or source of income, rather than maybe try to force our art to also be our livelihood. Or it could be that we have families or other relational duties that place limits on our creative time and resources. So the question is it possible to actually embrace and surrender to these constraints in ways that actually end up leading to a greater flourishing, not just of our creativity, but of our humanity? And I think the answer is yes, but I've definitely got a strong romantic streak reflected by a love of 19th century literature. And earlier on in life, as an aspiring writer, I think I definitely bought into a lot of those, you know, kind of romantic, eccentric ideals about what it means to be a quote unquote successful writer or artist. You know, like the artist needs solitude, the artist must be free of family and other entanglements because the normal rules of life just don't apply. In fact, for this presentation, I dug up one of my very first papers in college, and it's the paper that actually made me switch majors from biology to history and theology. And I saved it all these years because, as a reminder to myself as a writing teacher, that of the potential power of a teacher's comments and feedbacks, how they could, you know, there's a possibility they could redirect a life, because that's definitely what happened to me after the conversation this paper sparked with my professor. But this paper, so it's all about how writers and artists needed solitude. And, you know, in defense of my younger self, I do still agree with a lot of the ideas in the paper, and I think it kind of marked an acceptance for the first time of the introversion I'd been viewing as a very negative thing for most of my life. And, you know, I don't think any of us would disagree that obviously solitude and times of introspection are a part of most creative pursuits, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert or something in between. But just listen to this line I quoted from a biography on Emily Dickinson to explain why she pulled back from intimate relationships. She had to feel such love and intimacy completely and always, or not at all. there could be no middle ground. Perhaps this is fortunate for the lover of poetry today, for if she were not a recluse, quote, she probably would have married, had several children and several miscarriages, spent her days at the market and at the store, and in all probability would not have written a single line of poetry. Okay, 18-year-old self, that is just crazy. That Emily Dickinson likely wouldn't have written a line of poetry if she had become a wife or a mother or had really any demanding relationships at all, really. So I can laugh about it now or maybe just shake my head in shame, but this view honestly isn't that unlike a lot of the perspectives I first encountered as a new mom when I was pretty much reading everything I could find on motherhood and the writing life. A lot of them weren't very positive. The perspectives I was reading, it just kind of reiterated the idea that these are two things that are always going to be a source of great conflict and angst and agony. But that was the message I was finding, that parenting and pursuing a creative vocation are possible, but there are probably going to be some costs, and they will most likely be to the detriment of your art, because most people probably, at the end of the day will choose their children over their art, fortunately. But there was this sense that your art is going to suffer if you pursue these kinds of intense relationships, demanding relationships. And if any of you, remember this year's, tragic Golden Globe acceptance speech by the actress Michelle Williams, I think it's easy to see that this kind of either-or mindset around family and around art, it can have some serious consequences. Okay, so if there is this sense in the broader culture that the demands of family life are probably going to hinder us as creative people, are there any examples we can look to as counter-arguments? And it turns out there's actually quite a lot who disprove this notion of the eccentric solitary genius. So I am using quite a few examples here of married artists with children, because again, that can be a dynamic that often feels particularly all-consuming during certain seasons of life. But we can still think about this tension when it comes to really any relationship or caretaking role. So since this is an Anselm Society event, I've got to start with either C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien, and both will be mentioned at some point. So this is a photo of Tolkien napping with one of his sons. He had 4 children, and he did struggle with finding balance as a father, an intentional, involved father, as a professor, as a fiction author. And so he made it a point, to write very late at night, often into the early hours of the morning, in order not to cut into time with his family. And of course, we likely wouldn't even have The Hobbit, and maybe not even The Lord of the Rings, if it hadn't been for the fact that he had children, because as many of you probably know, he started The Hobbit as a story for his own kids. And it's amazing that so many writers, including S.D. Smith, another participant in this conference, will talk about how their imagination was sparked because their kids wanted a bedtime story. And so, this is definitely an example of how that role is a source of creativity rather than a detractor from it. But lest we think Lewis gets off easy because he spent most of his life as a bachelor, many of his biographies reveal just how involved he was in domestic life, whether as a caretaker to Mrs. Moore, the friend or the mother of the friend who was killed in the war, or even, of his brother Warnie, who, had a lifelong battle with alcoholism. And then later on, of course, he had his wife, Joy, whom he cared for, as she was suffering from cancer. And then he was also the stepfather to her 2 sons as well. So, Lewis was not sitting in some ivory tower somewhere, he was very much involved in normal relationships, normal domestic life as well. So my examples are mostly writers, and sorry about that, other visual artists, musicians, performing artists, but I did want to make sure I included at least one other type of artist. So we have Bach, one of the greatest classical composers of all time. And I did not know this before I did some research for this presentation, but he fathered 20 children. Sadly, only 10 lived to adulthood, but just given the extensive body of work Bach was able to come up with to create, that is pretty incredible, and I have to believe that his house was a fairly chaotic place. I also wanted to make sure that not all examples were from either middle class or wealthy, or even just typical nuclear families. And Louisa May Alcott is interesting in that sense. And there's definitely an argument to be made that her family had some strange ideas and they were pretty eccentric people. But it still seems that those intense bonds she had with her family, and also her motivation to lift her loved ones out of poverty through her writing, that gave her a lot of the inspiration and motivation to write such a beloved, timeless, centric work like Little Women. For a more recent example, the novelist Toni Morrison, she actually started writing fiction after she became a single mom, and she would get up at 4 a.m. to work on her novels before heading off to work. And it's interesting because I've read several articles and interviews with her about balancing her writing vocation with being a single mom, and the tone has never been negative. It's always seemed like she saw both callings as complementary, and never viewed the challenges of her situation as an impediment to her literary success. Kind of on a related note, I just want to read a poem from another more recent author, Alice Walker. And she said she was really struggling with the demands of motherhood and this need to write, and this strong calling she had around her writing. So she wrote this poem and she stuck it above her writing desk as a reminder. And it's addressed to herself. So she says, "Dear Alice, Virginia Woolf had madness, George Eliot had ostracism, somebody else's husband, and did not dare to use her own name. Jane Austen had no privacy and no love life. The Bronte sisters never went anywhere and died young and dependent on their father. Zora Hurston had no money and poor health. You have Rebecca," that's her daughter, "who is much more delightful and less distracting than any of the calamities above." And I just love that, if she's going to have some kind of chaos in her life, let it be the chaos of her own child, as opposed to, these other sources of calamity that we see so many writers and artists in the past who maybe kind of fit the eccentric ideal a bit more. Or even if they didn't, everybody's going to have some source of chaos to deal with as they try to pursue a creative vocation. Okay, I actually didn't mean to stop sharing. So what are our takeaways after looking at these examples? What can we learn from these caretaking centric artists about what it means to be humans with creative capacity, and to also be in some kind of caregiving role, or to have other real life responsibilities? So I'm just going to share three quick points on this. The first, I think we can look to, the scriptural example of Mary's yes to life. And, the Christian life, you could say, can really be summed up in Mary's fiat, her great yes to the life that God longed to bear in and through her. And in, both demanding relationships like marriage and parenthood, and in the work of creating art, when we say yes to chaos, or yes to mystery, in the sense of giving up some of our ownership and our false sense of control, then we can say yes to the ordering, cosmos creating movement of the Holy Spirit. And that's something Madeleine L'Engle talks about in Walking on Water as well. So I'll just read this quotation. She says, "I believe that each work of art, whether it is a work of great genius or something very small, comes to the artist and says, 'Here I am, enflesh me, give birth to me.' And the artist either says, 'My soul doth magnify the Lord,' and willingly becomes the bearer of the work, or refuses." Okay, the second point, cultivating any kind of culture, whether that's in a family or whether that's a culture in a church, that is an immensely creative, life-giving endeavor. So in other words, there's no such thing as a non-creative person, which is something I would tell my writing students all the time. And if you don't consider yourself a writer or an artist, I think it's really important to be reminded of this truth and to be reminded that raising a family or cultivating any kind of community is also a creative act. It's an art form that requires intention. And I imagine that is something Sally Clarkson is going to be talking about quite a bit in her presentation on the enchanted family. But, as we just saw with these examples, relational responsibilities like marriage and children, they can also have, the effect of deepening a person's craft as an artist. So embracing these restraints on our lives can be an invitation that actually sparks our creative capacities in new and exciting ways. And this is something that I was kind of surprised by, but have found to be a common theme on the blog, The Most Creative Thing, when I interviewed different writer and artist mothers. Many of them will claim that it actually wasn't until they had kids that they really uncovered their creative interests or started to take them seriously. And this, I think, is actually an area where the church can really partner with artists when it comes to kind of changing that either or narrative. Not only the voices in the broader culture that say artists should, maybe resist or be exempt from relational demands, but I'm guessing it's probably more common for artists of faith to internalize maybe some subtle voices that say, your art is just a nice hobby and it's something, a responsible Christian can pursue, yes, but you should probably put it away for certain seasons of life, maybe like the parenting years. Of course, we do all have to adjust to our priorities at different times of life, and there is a season to everything. But I think it would be immensely helpful to Christian writers and artists if they had, some validation from their church communities regarding the relational and the artistic vocations, and that these are both ways of creating that aren't contradictory. They both reflect how we are co-creators made in the image of God. And number 3, the point isn't the art, but the imago Dei who made it. Again, the reason we have creative capacity is because that's part of how we're made in God's image, and living into that identity is one of the ways we become a fully alive human being who by God's grace is an embodiment and a reflection of his love. So when we look to the writers and the artists who come closest to living out this purpose, as opposed to those who may have been considered, artistic geniuses, but weren't really the healthiest human beings overall, it becomes pretty clear that relational obligations and the chaos that often come with them can actually be a true gift in the life of a creative person. So I want to just close with start to wrap this up with another quotation from a wonderful book called Real Love for Real Life. I highly recommend it. And in it, the author Andy Ashworth talks a lot about how, what it means to be both a creative person and a person called to cultivate meaningful relationships. So in other words, what it means to live a truly creative life. So she says, as our society grows increasingly technological, consumer-oriented, isolated, and lonely, those who take their caregiving gifts and calling seriously can fill a tremendous void. Your gifts, your time, and your work are important. You are not alone. Like countless others throughout generations, you are participating in God's perfect design to love in the everyday realities of life. In doing so, you reflect the beauty of a God whose love knows no limit. Now, these words, I think, are especially poignant at this time, when a talk like this has to be delivered via a screen. But I hope they, in this presentation, have given you something to think about as we all prepare to go back into the world, hopefully soon, and, with God's help, create a cosmos out of this most recent experience of chaos. So thank you so much for sharing this time with me. So I'll just return to one of the questions we started with at the very beginning. How might God be asking you to help him create a cosmos in this place? And I will end with a poem by Malcolm Guite called For God So Loved the World. The whole round world, in Greek, the total cosmos, is all encompassed in this loving word, not just the righteous, right on, and religious, but every one of whom you've ever heard. And all the throng you don't know or ignore, for everyone is precious in his sight. Chosen and cherished, loved, redeemed before the circling cosmos ever saw the light. He set us in the world that we might flourish, that his beloved world might live through us. We chose instead that all of this should perish, and turned his blessing, every blessing, to a curse. And now he gives himself as life and light, that we might choose in him to set things right. Thank you so much.